So when you talk about translations, you must have at least two languages. So we have the original language and then we have the target language that we want to translate something into. So translations is about carrying or conveying meaning. So once again, we see the word meaning. So conveying meaning from one language into the other. If you talk about translations in general, there are two main issues. The first one is grammar, the second one is vocabulary. Now, why is grammar becoming one of the issues? It is simply because one language has different grammar structure from the other. So this can actually create problems as well as tensions for the translators. The second one is vocabulary. Once again, different languages have different vocabulary, and sometimes there's no words which is equivalent to the original word that you have in the original text. So this can create a lot of problems for the translators. So ladies and gentlemen, translations in general means that you are conveying meaning from one language into the other. Now, when you talk about translations, you have to look at what we call the theories of translations. Now, the theories, what are theories? Basically, theories are frameworks for you to understand issues and for you to make decisions. So in our discussion today, or in our revision today, we are going to look at two important theories. The first one is scopus, and the second one is polysystems. When you describe theories, when you describe scopus, for example, scopus as a theory of translation, you must always refer to the origin of the theory. And you must always refer to the text that is being used successfully by this theory. So basically, if you talk about scopus as a theory to translation, it originated from Germany. It is best used for linguistically biased texts, and it focuses on aims of doing translation. So that's theory number one. Theory number two is what we call polysystems. It originated from Russia, so it's Russian based, and it is best used for literary biased texts. For example, poems, short stories, or novels. And it focuses on the importance of language and culture during translations. Now, for scopus, the examples of texts that can be translated using scopus can be, for example, manuals or speeches, because they are linguistically biased texts. So, ladies and gentlemen, two theories for translation, scopus and polysystems. Now, before we look at the strategies, I would like to draw your attention to the approaches. Now, the two theories just now, scopus and polysystems, they actually give birth to 5 approaches, or what we can say as smaller framework. And these approaches are what we refer to as conventional approaches or traditional approaches to translation. So basically, two theories as the umbrella, and then we have 5 approaches, the smaller framework. So the first one is scopus. So scopus as a theory has one approach, which is also named as scopus. So it focuses on aims and purposes of doing translation. So when you want to use scopus in your translation practice or exercise, you must always refer to the audience. You must always know what's the purposes of doing the translation. So that's number one. The second approach is what we call equivalent, or word-for-word translation. So word-for-word translation or equivalent, it comes under polysystem theory. The third one is what we call descriptive translation studies. So basically you describe, you summarize the main points, and this is under the polysystem theory. The fourth one or the third under polysystem would be eco-translatology. So basically when you talk about eco-translatology, you will base your translation on surroundings, on your perceptions, and you have to select and you have to adapt. And the last approach is what we call as cultural translation. So basically the culture of the target language is very, very important if you use this approach, and this approach is under polysystem theory. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, 2 theories, the umbrella, and 5 approaches, the smaller framework under these 2 theories. Specifically, these approaches, they are called conventional or traditional approaches to translation. So basically, we have Scopus under Scopus theory, and then we have 4 approaches: equivalent, descriptive, eco-translatology, as well as cultural translation under polysystem theory. Now, let's have a look at the strategies when you do translation. After looking at the theory, after looking at the approaches, we have 2 strategies when you want to do translation. You can choose to do foreignization, or you can choose to do domestication. Foreignization is when you, as a translator, wants to uphold the culture of the source language. That means the original language. So you want to uphold that, you want to maintain that. So that is what we call foreignization strategy to translation. For domestication, on the other hand, is when you as a translator is interested in keeping the values and culture of the target language. So your focus as a translator when you use domestication strategy is to make sure that readers or whoever is asking you to do the translation know the culture of the target language more. So that's 2 strategies, ladies and gentlemen. 2 theories, 5 approaches, conventional approaches, and then 2 strategies for translation. Now, coming back to approaches a little bit. When you have the traditional or conventional approaches to translation, of course, today we have the what we call contemporary approach to translations. And these include, there are 6 actually, including socio-linguistic approach to translation, we have linguistic approach to translation, and we also have semiotic approach to translation. So basically, there are 5 conventional or traditional approaches to translation, and these are under the 2 theories, Scopus as well as polysystems. And then we have actually 6 contemporary or modern approaches to translations, including linguistic approach, social-linguistic approach, as well as semiotic approach. So there's 6 of them. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, those are the theories, strategies, and approaches under translations. And now we are going to look at subcategories of translation. So the first one, we have poetry translation. Now, poetry translation is when you relay a poem from one language into the other according to sound-based, syntactic, structural, or pragmatic. Now, if you look at the structure of a poem, it looks like a song. And because of that, it is sound-based. And because of that, it's also structural. And because of that, it's also pragmatic. So when you talk about poetry translation, the definition is relaying poetry into another language according to sound-based, syntactic, structural, or pragmatic. And there are 2 main trends Of course, there are many other trends, but we are focusing on only two main trends. The first one is cross-cultural practices. That means when you do translation, of course, a poem is very heavily biased with cultural practices. So you will be crossing these cultural practices from one culture to the other. So that's the first trend. The second trend is online translation. Now, nowadays, a lot of translators, they actually use the assistance of the internet or online translation in order to translate. However, when you do online translation, especially for poems, it loses that emotions, that emotional intelligence. So very importantly for you to remember, human translation sometimes is better than online translation. So ladies and gentlemen, two main trends of poetry translation: cross-cultural practices and online translation. And then we look at issues. There are two issues of poetry translation, at least two main issues. The first one is culturally biased. As I have mentioned just now, poems, they are very heavily loaded with cultural practices. So because of that, sometimes it can be quite confusing if you are not familiar with the culture of the target language. So you may have problems, so you may have issue when you want to do translation. And the second issue when you want to do poetry translation is which theories or which approaches or which strategies to use. So all this can become a heavy burden for young translators especially. The second subcategory is what we call first to second language translation. Now, what does it mean by first to second language translation? So if you look at an example, let's say, take myself as an example. My first language is Bahasa Melayu. My second language is English. So when I say I'm doing first to second language translation, is I'm actually doing Bahasa Melayu to English translation. So that is first to second language translation. And there's one particular trend of first to second language translation, and it is called trans-adaptation. So trans-adaptation is when both language and culture play a very important role during the translation process. So it's not only the language that you want to translate, but the culture that you have to translate as well. The third subcategory under translations is what we call second to third language translation. Now, if we take the same example, which is myself, my second language is English, and then my third language is, for example, Arabic. So I am doing translation from English to Arabic. There are two main issues when doing second to third language translation. The first one is grammar and vocabulary mismatch. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, my second language is not my native language. So I may not have the competency or the ability to do translation from second to third. So that's why you have grammar and vocabulary mismatch. And the second issue is what we call cultural differences that can be confusing. Most of the time, because the second language is not your native language, and of course it's not your first culture, you may have a confusion. There's a mixture of first to second and maybe other influences as well. So these cultural differences can create problem when you want to do translation from second to third language. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not here, but one thing that scholars all over the world agree is the fact that this term, language transfer. So what is language transfer? Language transfer is when you use your knowledge of your first language in order to understand the second language. So for example, if you want to do translation from first to second language, from Bahasa Melayu to English, so you know certain rules in your own language. So you try to use it when you do translation to the second language. So that is basically language transfer. So that's number one, the arguments by scholars all over the world. The second one is the fact that most scholars agree that it is easier to do translation from second to first language. For example, take myself. So that means it's easier to do translation from English to Bahasa Melayu. So these two arguments, language transfer as well as it's easier to do translation from second to first language, they are arguments. So some scholars or some translators may not agree with this, but these are the things that you have to keep in mind when you do translation. But I tend to agree with the second argument because I find that it's easier for me personally to do translation from English to Bahasa Melayu rather than from Bahasa Melayu to English. I guess it is because my first language is Bahasa Melayu, so it's easier to transfer to Bahasa Melayu because I know Bahasa Melayu more. I know Malay culture more. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have actually looked at translation. As I said, this is the biggest concept, critical concept that we have learned this semester. So basically, under translations, it's about conveying meaning. We talk about theories, we talk about approaches, we talk about strategies, and then we talk about subcategories. So all of this, they bring back to one word, which is meaning.